First of all, it's amazing to see so many people come to hear me talk about this, and also so many people to come to the exhibition. It's very exciting for us as the team who created the film, because so much of the work is done in an extremely cloistered space. We created the film basically in this little room above a laundromat in Parkville, a tiny space with 2 computers and most of the time 2 guys working on it, doing animation and lighting. And our animator was actually sanding the floors for the studio to get it up to scratch. So it was like a really tiny operation. The downside of that, well, the great thing about it is the privacy of the imagination that you're allowed to develop in such a small space. The downside is nobody really gets to see that. So it's nice then to have an exhibition where you can show all the working material that goes towards a film or any other project. And for us creators, that's the most interesting part. So creating any work for me is very much like doing a jigsaw puzzle, and it's nice when it's finished, but the real fun part is doing the actual puzzle. So this evening I'm going to talk a little bit about the film adaptation, but also in the broader context of my work as an illustrator. So, you know, as a complement to the exhibition, so to try and understand, well, answers to the basic questions that I'm always asking other artists. You know, they seem like dumb questions. Where do your ideas come from? And why are you the way you are? But I think they're legitimate questions coming from outside, because you don't necessarily know. So I thought I'd start off with this self-portrait, myself as a lost thing. I kind of see drawing as, when it's really working well, it's something of an automatic process, you know, not thinking too critically. And one of the things about giving a lecture on your own work is there's this risk of analysing things after the fact. And I can't emphasise enough that when I'm working on something, I'm really not quite sure what it's about. So anything I say here this evening that seems highly intellectual, just remember that all came afterwards, you know, explaining what I did. Even this is a self-portrait. I didn't know that's what it was, but in hindsight, that is, I think, what it is. So going back a little bit, this is one of my early drawings, and I do like looking at the drawings I did as a child, because I see a direct continuity between what I was doing then and what I'm doing now. Of course, there was a lot of convoluted changes along the way, and I certainly didn't always want to be an artist. In fact, that kind of ended, the idea of being an artist ended around the age of 12, when someone told me you don't make any money. So I immediately, like, I've got to rethink this whole thing. And it's only like years later that I came back to drawing, just because almost I couldn't help myself. That's just how things ended up. But looking at this old work, there's a freshness and a spontaneity about children's art that is free of pretension and anything other than a desire to share an experience, both with another person but also to yourself. And a lot of drawing is an intensely private activity. I'm sure many of you here are artists yourselves, which is probably what attracted you to come and listen to me talk. And you'll know that it's really about just figuring out what you think. You know, you don't always know until you put it on the page, and drawing is thinking. So the line appears simultaneously with the thought. Anyway, this was a drawing I did at the age of 6 in grade 1. And recently I was asked to reinterpret the drawing or revisit it. And the interesting thing about this is, when I look at the stuff I did as a kid, I don't remember much about my childhood, but I remember exactly the moment when I was drawing these pictures, because it's kind of fossilised on this layer of paper like a piece of shale. And the feeling kind of is easy to open up again and revisit. Interestingly, I think the original drawing is way better than the reinterpretation. There's just some drama to it that I couldn't quite get at again as a clever adult artist. This is another self-portrait, an image from the picture book, The Red Tree, and again, just sort of illustrating my point about drawing as an intensely private, solitary activity, figuring out something for yourself, and then sharing it with another person. In my case, choosing the medium of published books primarily as a way of showing my work. It's very rare for me to have an exhibition of paintings. I had one last year, and that was the first one. I find having work published is a very satisfying way of showing my ideas, partly because there's some distance there, which I find interesting. The fact that I sort of work behind a curtain, then I sort of slide the work out underneath the curtain, and the publisher picks it up and publishes it, and I don't really have to front up like this to an audience. I can sort of maintain a certain distance, which I find interesting, and it's actually a theme in my work, is distances between characters and distances between types of communication. This image from The Arrival is an example of that idea of an examination of space and emptiness. Like, I feel that all of us are trying to connect with things around us, but we're also aware at the same time of vast distances, and these are distances that are both physical and cultural and psychological and emotional, and that is, there's these constant gaps in our lives and in our relationship with other people and other things that we're trying to cross. Sometimes those gaps are cultural, such as in a picture like this, and the communication that passes between beings is, well, it's not telepathic, you know, there's no real such thing as telepathy. Instead, we send out these packets of ideas using language or line or music, and they travel across, you know, the empty vacuum of space, which just has a few atoms scattered in between, and then it reaches another person, and that person receives that package and interprets it in their own way. But there is no direct, you know, line of electricity that goes from one mind to another. We all have to connect with each other across this chasm. And so this interests me as an illustrator. And once again, this is an idea that I only thought about after doing all these drawings and thinking, what do they have in common? And this realisation is there's characters who are often mute. Sometimes they physically don't have a mouth, or they're very physically inept, and they're trying to communicate in some way, such as this foreign exchange student that comes to live with an Australian family, and he's asking them all sorts of questions that they can't answer, such as, why does a plug hole look like a flower? In the case of this picture book, The Rabbits, which was one of the first picture books that I worked on, the distance is an ideological one, and that's what initially attracted me to this story written by John Marsden. And then looking at Australian history and realising the immense chasm that existed between European and Aboriginal people when at moments of first contact. A real kind of science fictional subject, actually, and that's how I treated it when illustrating this book. And of course, in The Arrival, which is internationally probably my best known work, largely because it's wordless. I don't know if that's a reflection on my writing skills. The most successful book is the one where I finally stopped writing. But that's largely about, on one hand, it's about migrant experience, but that, for me, is just a coat hanger on which to hang all sorts of other ideas, and there's something more fundamental going on, and I think it's the chasm between ourselves and the world, and that we're constantly having to renegotiate our place in the world. Using a migrant character going to another country is a good way of demonstrating that, but you don't even have to travel anywhere or experience anything new to confront this problem, which is like an existential or ontological problem of what is my relationship to the things that are familiar to me? How well do I know them? And it's quite easy to tap into this dilemma when you just substitute familiar things such as, say, a dog with a giant walking tadpole. And when you think about it, there's really not a great deal of difference between a dog and a giant walking tadpole. It's just you know one better than the other. And so a big theme in my work on reflection is a kind of everyday ignorance, like what don't we know? And what do we lull ourselves into feeling is understandable just because it's familiar, just because we see it all the time. We think we know it, but really it's as strange as it ever was. And that's true of language and words as well. They're these strange little particles that we bandy about. They weren't invented by us, we just adopted them and we start using them ourselves. And it's the same with imagery. Everything's just borrowed stuff that we exchange with each other, and it's fundamentally strange. And this, of course, goes right back to childhood and when you're very little. This is a portrait of my dad and me. And there's a constant attempt between parent and child to create some sort of connection, even though you know that you couldn't be more culturally different and even, neurologically different. And my wife and I just had a baby a little over a month ago. And so I'm experiencing this again, but from the other side of the equation of trying to connect with this being, but knowing that you can connect in a way where you don't have to be the same at all. You can be completely different and see the world in entirely different terms, but still have some kind of positive shared experience that means something. So meaning doesn't necessarily mean understanding. And of course this all leads into the loss thing, which is, almost like the most distilled of my stories in some ways, because you have this character, the lost thing, which is completely nameless, faceless, lacking in a specific personality or meaning. It doesn't have any purpose. It doesn't even have a place. And it becomes the embodiment of things that can't be named or labelled or put in a comfortable place. And the central idea of the story is an extremely simple one. In fact, when I first wrote it, I was so paranoid that I was just regurgitating a story that I'd heard before because it seemed so obvious. Boy finds a lost pet that can't be categorised and then takes it around trying to find out where it belongs. That's a classic storybook formula. I guess the twist here is that I found the environment around the creature is far more interesting than the creature itself. I don't actually think that much about the lost thing. For me, it's kind of just this walking metaphor. It's how people react to it that's interesting. And this, if I just go back to that image, the landscape here is to some extent inspired by my childhood growing up in the outer suburbs of Perth. I grew up in Hillary's on the coast about 25 kilometres north of Perth. And at the time in the late 70s and 80s, that was a new housing development, or at least a lot of new housing developments were springing up in that area. And the trees hadn't started growing yet, and so it actually felt quite bleakly suburban. And even for a kid with no other point of reference, it still felt something not quite right about it. And I guess I've spent most of my life living in the outer suburbs. I'm gradually creeping in, so I'm now in Brunswick. But I'm still interested in the quietness of everyday life and the fact that most of the time nothing is happening, and a lot of us have to deal with that. The sheer duration of life when not much is going on. And I don't know, it's sort of a fascinating subject for me. As a young person, I spent so much time resisting my surroundings. This is the only drawing that I have as a teenager, really, of the suburbs around where I lived, because I thought that art was something about other places. It was special. I would paint a lot when I went on holidays with my family, and we went to the southwest coast. I thought that's when you do a painting, you see a nice coastal scene. As I've gotten older, I've started to get closer and closer to home, and even though my stories are very outlandish and they're set in otherworldly places, they're essentially about ordinary life in the suburbs. So this is the neighbourhood where I grew up. Quite nice, extremely quiet. Sort of in my mind it's eternally 5 o'clock in the afternoon, but probably that's the time when, as kids, we were flushed out into the streets and parks, and where most of the after-school imaginative time happens. And then sort of later on in my early 20s, I went back and I started to draw a lot of my childhood places, or things that were familiar to me, certain stretches of road that I would pass all the time. So that's a bit of West Coast Highway on the left, and on the right is that same scene from previously. You can sort of see it's more or less the same houses. But one thing I did notice at this point was that painting and drawing was most interesting when it was a distortion of life, not when it was recording it accurately. So I became less interested in my early 20s with representational art. I still wanted to represent things, but I thought there must be some way of showing how I feel about the place beyond simply replicating its appearance. Once you've mastered those skills as an artist of how to draw well, there's this urge to want to do something else, and that is to change things and get people to see things almost in a caricatured way. Like all art is a form of caricature to some extent, where you're picking out elements in the environment and you're exaggerating them. And so that's, in my early 20s, I started to become really interested again in the idea of being an artist. And when I'm not illustrating books, I'm doing a lot of paintings of suburban scenes, which are often studies in colour and space and light, but they're also subconsciously have something to say, if you want to put it that way, on the subject of isolation or dealing with your relationship with familiar everyday objects and the strangeness of reality. Also, my choice of subjects is an element of laziness. So this is just a footpath out the front of my house I was living in Perth, just not wanting to go very far for a subject. But I find the older I get, the less further I venture from the studio to paint things. So I started doing like paintings of my lounge room and bedroom now, and eventually it'll boil down to just paintings of my drawing table. Just because these things become more and more interesting the more time I spend looking at them. And art really is about getting you to just look at ordinary things in a new way, so you realise they're actually quite special. And you can see in some cases where the experience of painting real-life landscapes helps inform the imagination when it comes to doing something relatively quirky like The Lost Thing. So this is a painting probably from my mid-20s, around the same time I was working on The Lost Thing, of North Beach along the west coast, which has this very interesting concrete embankments and concrete steps with rails, and in summer very hot and baking, and then the cool ocean at the foot of all this, and the city or the suburbs and shops crowding the upper edge. And I found that just a real interesting space full of tension. And I didn't know it at the time, but maybe years later I looked back and I went, oh, okay, that's basically North Beach. But when I wrote the story and I set it on the beach, I didn't really have this in mind. I just imagined a pretty typical suburban beach. And that often happens when I'm writing a story, is I don't think about it visually necessarily. I just think in terms of very open concepts packaged in simple words. And then when it comes to illustrate, I sort of start asking questions. Okay, what kind of beach is it? And what do I know about beaches? And what beaches have impressed me? And the next thing I know, I'm drawing these, 100-foot concrete walls and totally treeless, airless-looking environment with a slight chemical stain to the sky. The main character in The Lost Thing is more or less a self-portrait, as either directly or indirectly are a lot of other characters in my stories, and I think that's true for many writers and artists. I think it was Socrates who said the painter always paints himself, and in a way you can't avoid that, because any representation of the world that you do is coming out of your own mind, and so in some ways it's a self-portrait. Why not just cut to the chase and draw yourself directly into the story? So the bad posture, the nerdy hobbies, the solitary walking along the beach, that's kind of me around my mid-teenage years. In this case, the character seeking refuge and collecting bottle tops. And here's the bottle top collection, which I made from the bottle tops of my housemate's Sunday sessions with his friends, and they all came over and watched football, and they left the bottle tops. I said, give me all your bottle tops, and I cut out textbooks, physics and engineering textbooks that my dad had from the 60s and stuck them to the top of these bottle tops. And that partly inspired the whole idea of the mechanical, bureaucratic world of the lost thing, a society in which there is no aesthetic quality. Everything is purely functional and very much around bureaucracy and engineering. All life functions are reduced to their most measurable characteristics. So into this universe, this thing appears, the lost thing, or the giant red tomato, as we used to call it when we were working on the film, because that's what it looked like when things were half animated. And the main character has stumbled across this creature. Of course, when I was writing the story originally, I just had the phrase, the lost thing, and I thought I'll worry about what it looks like later. So I wasn't really thinking in terms of scale or what it did. But I did imagine it as a dog at first. I'll just say it's kind of a dog, but I just won't use the word dog. And then when you come and start illustrating something, it's very interesting when you play around with expectations. And I thought, well, how big can I make this thing and it can still fit on the page and get around the city? Actually, we never know how it gets around the city. It just kind of, in both the book and film, it cuts to the next scene when it says they caught a tram or something. It's the magic of picture books. And so almost like making things very awkward for myself as an artist in order to challenge the concept of how inconvenient can this creature be. And then the interesting thing for me is that this was the starting point for the story, really, this image, which was originally a tiny sketch in one of my sketchbooks. And it was interesting because the main character, the human character, is responding so openly to this freakish creature, which to me looks a bit alarming. You know, if I saw this in real life, and I do imagine myself as a real character wandering along the beach coming across this thing, I'd be frightened and I would leave it alone. You know, I wouldn't touch it, I wouldn't talk to it. And it interested me in the drawing that I did is, oh, this character seems to be talking to the creature and the creature is responding with some delight. And that was sort of the starting point for the whole story. I didn't really know what it was going to be about or where it was going to go, but the unexpected emotional reaction to a thing is often a good place to start with a story. And in this case, instead of avoiding the creature or running away in fear when the tentacles and claws come out, this character is just neutrally waving hello. And in some ways, I thought it's because he doesn't have the sense to be afraid. You know, he's too innocent or something. And that's almost like to his benefit. So again, getting back to the theme of ignorance, his ignorance about how to respond is actually quite helpful and means that he has an interesting journey. So we'll just play a clip from the film, which is kind of the closest to a direct adaptation of that sequence in the book.
This all happened many summers ago, down at the beach. I was, as usual, working tirelessly on my bottle top collection. At least until I saw the thing. It sure wasn't doing much. It just sat there, with a really weird look about it. You know, a sad, lost sort of look. Nobody else seemed to notice it was there. They were all too busy doing other stuff, I guess. Hello? friendly, and I played with the thing for most of the afternoon. It was great fun, yet the whole time I couldn't help feeling that something wasn't quite right. As the hours slouched by, it seemed less and less likely that anyone was coming to take the thing home. Soon there was no denying the unhappy truth. It was lost.
So, where did the idea come from? Well, I've already explained that a little bit. With the creature itself, it originally started off as a photograph on the cover of a wildlife magazine of a pebble crab, or a soldier crab, which is a little blue crab that lives in mangrove swamps, and it has these claws that kind of hang down in that vertical way, a very cute sort of way. And that was just lying around, and I kept looking at it, and so I thought, that's a nice shape, that'll do, you know, that could work. At the same time, I was also looking at, I can't remember why, but antique collectors' catalogues, probably for some other project where I needed to do antique stoves, find out what antique stoves look like, and I thought, they look almost like a creature, especially when they've got little legs. It's like they've got this kind of a mouth, and they've got a breathing part, like the chimney, and they've got these little legs. And the other idea that came to me was my very first pet that I had as a kid, which was a crazy crab, which I could never quite understand what it was. I was really young, and my parents just said, oh, here's some crazy crabs. And I didn't know if they were animals or machines, or it was explained to me that the shell comes from another creature, that they actually turn that into their house. And I'm thinking, how does that work? So those sort of concepts sort of came together while I was drawing, but I wasn't even thinking about it at the time. It's only afterwards that it occurred to me, and this is where the subconscious is such a good thing, it occurred to me, oh yes, the hermit crab concept makes sense because the creature doesn't have a home of its own. So it sort of adopted some kind of fabric from the city, which is this mutated piece of industrial equipment. Maybe it's a discarded piece of machinery, and it's sort of, you know, extruded its body into this form. The main thing for me was that it doesn't have a face, and I've always been attracted to characters that are faceless and very hard to deal with in terms of an interpersonal relationship. My favourite character of all time as a child was R2-D2 for this reason. I just was watching Star Wars just for R2-D2, really. It was like the best character in the whole movie. And the reason is he had so much personality, which was expressed using only a rotating dome and some beeps. And that was pretty much it. And yet you knew he was cheeky and feisty and very strong-willed and all these sorts of things. And you feel a great affection for him. And again, years later, I realised the Lost Thing is kind of a version of R2-D2. It's a helpless, largely limbless character that can't do much for itself and is covered in little doors. So now I know where the doors come from. So this was the first sketch that I did, and it kind of set up, I didn't know what the story was, but it set up some situations that were, you know, quite interesting, such as the dog barking at the creature and it retracting all its tentacles in. So the idea that the environment around it is quite hostile, and also that the main character ends up feeding the creature Christmas decorations. That was very important to me for some reason. And again, it was only later that made sense, that Christmas decorations are maybe the only joyful thing left in this world. Like, even in the most unimaginative household, you might still get this flurry of light and colour around Christmas time as these dusty boxes of decorations are unpacked and put up. And people may have long ago forgotten what the purpose of the Christmas tree is. Probably some weird pagan thing. But it's still there. It's got this kind of aesthetic content and it's purposeless. Like a Christmas tree is not useful. So that was kind of important, that the lost thing would want to eat something that is not useful. And then I had this scene, which you can see there, that later on it would excrete this crushed up cube of grey Christmas decorations. Like it had extracted all the goodness out of it for its own character. That never really worked its way into the story, so it had to be left out. It's these sacrifices you need to make. So moving on from those early kind of concept drawings, I did these, what's called a dummy, just drawing a rough layout of the book. I knew it had to be 32 pages long because of printing processes, and had a rough idea of what format was economical for the publisher. Having presented them at first with a text, and they said they were interested as long as I developed it a little bit more, so I went back and did all these drawings to sort of flesh it out. And this process is very important for me because I'm thinking about what's happening, and the story offers up its own opportunities and resistances along the way. So you realise that some ideas don't make sense, others are really good, and some just don't fit. You have to keep moving things around. And so usually when I'm working, I will cut things out and stick them together again in different arrangements to try and find out what the story is doing. In these days, I didn't have a computer, so I was doing that physically with scissors and tape, but nowadays I tend to use Photoshop, and I just scan in my sketches and I cut them and move them around. Once I sort of had an idea of the story, and I'd come up with this concept of this almost a post-ecological city where there's no trees or plants, which makes the lost thing stand out even more as an organic form. I started to look at the work of other artists who had more or less approached a similar kind of scenery. The late Geoffrey Smart was one with this very famous painting, which I knew from my days studying art in high school. And Edward Hopper, sort of something of an ancestor to the work of Geoffrey Smart, a painter who was maybe one of the first to depict these urban scenes as desolate places. A lot of people living together very closely, and many of them couldn't possibly be more lonely. And he's a real master of giving this sense of the city as a very ambiguous place. Also Charles Shearer, a painter, a contemporary of Hopper's, that was working mainly around the 40s producing paintings such as this, with a movement called the Precisionist movement. And Charles Shearer is very interested in industrial landscapes and both paintings and photographs of pipes and things like that. Partly as a comment on the changing landscape, but also I think for their own innate beauty. There's not necessarily anything critical about these works. And also films such as Brazil. And you can see the similarity between this kind of strange landscape in Brazil and some of these other artists, particularly almost a post-ecological feeling, a place that's dominated by humans, steel, glass and concrete and paperwork, and they're all just sort of milling around in this strange little asylum, dreaming of something better. And so Brazil was a very big influence on me, I think as a teenager. It's a film that I've watched many times. The first time I saw it, I hated it because I thought it was meant to be a comedy and I didn't find it funny at all. I found it incredibly depressing. And I just kept going back to it again and again and watching it, partly for its kookiness, but also for that strange feeling of an enclosed little world that's like a dream that makes its own strange sort of sense. And then going back even earlier to painters such as the Surrealists in the 1920s and their use of discordant perspective and these weird sort of antique-looking modern worlds. and even further, looking at something that's the complete opposite of Smart, Hopper, Sheila, and these sort of artists. Someone who's delighting in this mad play of organic form. So this is Hieronymus Bosch's The Garden of Earthly Delights, a painting that I find sort of attractive and also quite disturbing. I think it's sort of meant to be a representation of heaven, but it's kind of a bit creepy if you look at the details in it. And a reproduction of this was stuck on the fridge of the share house I was living in when I was working on the Lost thing. So every time I went to get something from the fridge or waiting for something to heat up in the microwave, I was looking at this picture. And then I went to this Mambo exhibition at the Art Gallery of Western Australia, and I was really struck by this particular image by Reg Mombassa. The little hairy dog, little dog trumpet, is talking with his mother, and he says, "Are there any fascists in heaven?" And the mother says, "Yes, dear, but they all get turned into footballs, so you can kick them around if you want, but it's best to ignore them. They probably want to be kicked anyway." And I thought, wow, truer words have never been spoken. And what I liked most about this picture was the philosophers in the image are so freakish, and yet they're so sane. And I felt there was some truth to that only characters that could be so bizarre and malformed and carrying a basket of intestines or whatever could actually have such a great perspective on what is normal and abnormal in terms of human behaviour. And so all of these elements, the Bosch, Mombassa, and again, going back to those antique collectors' catalogues of different bits of machinery and furniture, sort of blended together, maybe with an element of Dr. Seuss as well, into this landscape which I kept referring to as utopia, I guess in reference a little bit to the Hieronymus Bosch painting, the idea of a dreamlike world when nothing makes sense, nothing has any purpose, everything is mismatched and nobody can clearly communicate with anybody else, and yet they're all very happy, in contrast to the world where the opposite in all cases is true. Everything is functional, logical, ordered, comfortable, and everyone is extremely unhappy. And the book is really about taking those ideas and just playing with them, and this kind of dichotomy between worlds. And also along the way, whenever I get an idea for an image, my tendency as an art history student, because I didn't really study illustration formally, I studied art history, is to go and look at artists who've dealt with this problem before, because there's no such thing as a really original idea. There's only like a reshuffling of different ideas in a new order. And so there was this scene where I wanted the boy to be feeding the Lost thing, Christmas decorations, and I felt this is an incredibly intimate, special scene. It's about as close as they get to any kind of direct communication, and it has a sort of religious feeling about it. And so I was looking at a lot of religious painters who were using this chiaroscuro technique, or very localized light sources, which suggests a spiritual light as well as a physical light. And sort of using that in my own rather amusing image, but on some level it's the purpose of the illustration is to affect you emotionally. It's not really to convey an idea or communicate any information. It's just to give you a feeling first and foremost. So even though you don't know what's going on, you don't really understand the motivations of the characters or the situation, you get this basic feeling of warmth and some kind of tender compassion. This is particularly highlighted by the relief of the world around it, which is very grey and angular and not so inviting. Also, this is maybe the only close-up we get in the book where we see characters filling the frame of the picture. Most places, both in the book and the film, everything is seen as at a distance, and the characters are dwarfed by this very non-humanist environment around them. So, to go from book to film, I thought at first, this will be an easy process, because I originally did think of the book as a little film. And for any of you interested in short filmmaking and don't have any money, I do recommend doing a picture book because it's so much cheaper. I think it cost me about $600 to do all the artwork on The Lost Thing. And the film was in the order of hundreds of thousands, not high, but it was pretty low by film standards, but I was shocked at the budgets of filmmakers. In any case, creatively, I thought, oh, well, this is a simple exercise of, you just take the illustration and you animate it and you fill in all the gaps and you've got a story. And I had a few goes at that through storyboarding, but that didn't quite work. What ended up was a fairly dull-looking sequence of joined movements, and I realised that adapting this as a film would require going back and rebuilding it from scratch, so having to reimagine the whole thing again. Fortunately, a film is a collaborative effort, and had I been just working on this by myself, I think it would have been a terrible film. I had a great association with an excellent producer who'd had a lot of animation experience, and also, as an Australian producer, understood something of the tone of the story. I was working with a British co-director who had more knowledge of technical process and how you go from, like an idea on paper to something that actually has life on the screen. And then, of course, later on working with very experienced animators, digital artists, sound designers, and a composer to develop what you see finally on the screen. But in the first instance, of course, everything starts off as these pretty basic drawings, and they're quite cheap to do, like a picture book, and you can do them again and again, and I certainly did until I became quite sick of drawing The Lost Thing and the boy. I'm very good at drawing them, but it was very tedious. I went through so many different versions of the story just trying to make it work. In terms of motion, animating the characters required a lot of research and development. Fortunately, having the book, which outlines the behaviour of the characters and the situation, is already a cue for how things are meant to move. And I think for our principal animator, Leo Baker, it was often just a case of looking at the creature and intuiting how it might move based on the tininess of its legs, the mass of its body, and its kind of shy behaviour throughout the book. But we did have long discussions about each character and how they would move, and using animal references. I think The Lost Thing was primarily a combination of a dog, horse and elephant for different attitudes that it might have throughout the story. But this was the first drawing I ever did where I was trying to explain how the things on its body worked, and their function, if you can call it that. And then having to design the creature again so that it could be built digitally. I found that a lot of my painted images actually cheat with perspective and scale, so they wouldn't work if you recreated them literally. In order to make things work, you have to sort of think more like an engineer and go back and redesign everything very precisely. And that's just not a problem of how things look, but how they work so that you don't get this issue of crashing geometry, which is a common problem for animation, where one part of the object passes through another part, or things just don't fit in the place where they're meant to go. Translating the human characters into animated characters was particularly difficult. If you look at the illustrations in the book, they're almost cartoon-like, sort of flattened out Gary Larson look to them. They don't translate so easily to 3 dimensions, and there is this problem also of the uncanny valley, that the closer you get to things looking realistic, the more creepy they become. And I think a lot of the first passes we had on character development actually looked very creepy, or just weird. And it's interesting, when we were doing this project, that Ron Muick actually did the first model of the boy in The Lost Thing, and just out of Sculpey. And that was before we really had established what was happening in the story. And a lot of those original models in practice didn't work because you couldn't get him walking up steps or just doing sort of basic gestures because of the length of his feet, where his hands sort of went in space and so on. I also had to think in terms of facial expressions, which is something I usually skip as an illustrator. You know, if possible, I'll get away with a couple of dots and a line for a face. But when creating something that's going to be viewed in such clarity and dimension, small emotional signals do need to be conveyed through physical movement. And there was always a question in developing this film of how expressive should it be, because when we look at a lot of animated films, we'll notice that there tends to be a lot of exaggerated facial expression, lively character movement, and this holds our interest to a large extent, and it's part of the magic of animation. However, my style of storytelling is very deadpan and even quite bland. I love characters' faces that are just expressionless. One of my favourite books is a series of books called Mr. Lunch, and it's this little dog, and his expression stays the same on every page. It just doesn't change at all, and I just find that so funny. Does that work on screen? I think to some extent, but we really had to experiment quite a bit to try and figure out, because one of the things I did find moving from the static painted image, and that's my background as a painter and illustrator, to something that's moving in time, is moving images become boring really quickly. I don't know why that is. There's something about a painted image that feels infinitely interesting for me, because maybe your imagination is able to adapt to the temporal universe of the page, and so you just think your imagination actually fills in a lot of gaps. But when you move to screen and you're actually directing a lot of action for the audience, you do risk boring them with your own interpretation, which might be, in my case, a little bit too languid and a little bit too flat. So that was a constant debate through every step of the process, from character design through to music and voiceover, is how lively should it be. We don't want to distance the audience, but we also want to tell them that this is a story about feeling distant. There's a portrait of John Howard in there. Just need to add that. And maybe another politician as well. So these are the three-dimensional models which were developed from the drawings. The first thing you'll notice is they're very stiff and wooden, which is something that naturally occurs when you take the liveliness of handmade drawing, you translate it into the geometry of virtual objects. And instead of fighting that and trying to make things, you know, more cartoon-like or lively, I thought, great, they're wooden, let's make them even more wooden. So a lot of the movement in The Lost Thing of the characters is actually quite stiff and a little bit robotic. So seeing the qualities of the medium as an advantage rather than a problem, I thought that worked very well with the society that it's trying to depict, which is quite a, you know, mechanical, dull society. People wouldn't be that expressive. So my direction always to Tom Bryant, who was the guy developing the models, was imagine you're carving them from a piece of wood. You know, don't make them too elaborate or too lively. I really enjoyed doing all of these background drawings. For me, the character of the city is as interesting as anything else that happens in the story, and as a painter, I'm as interested in background details as foreground details. Although I do notice in film they tend to move past rather quickly. But there's a lot of details in the film, also in the book, and all of them have some kind of meaning for the greater story. I try not to be gratuitous in the use of unnecessary detail if I can. So these are just more concept drawings for the city environment. And then the other world of the creatures was a lot of fun, partly because you can't really do anything wrong when you're creating a creature. No one can say that tentacle is too long or short. That's just the way it is. At the same time, you do have to spend a lot of time drafting different shapes to get them to look natural. So somehow every creature has a very specific personality, and it's a funny thing when you're drawing or painting is the picture starts telling you what to do, like it needs a lot of teeth or its legs are too long or something, and it reaches a point where it just feels right. And I don't know why that is, but I know I'm finished when things start feeling right. And so these characters we referred to as, when developing the film, as the proud parents, a mother, obviously, and a father, and their offspring, which they're looking after. And that's a French dew bottler, because dew rises in the morning, so naturally if you bottled it, you could levitate. This is a drawing that I did afterwards, so it's for a lost thing that never really was in the film and wouldn't have belonged, but I like it anyway, so I thought I'd show it. I was very interested here in the idea of obsolete technology, and that is a theme that runs through the lost thing. The fact that we live in a world where we're very good at forgetting things, like we almost train ourselves to forget, and nowhere is this more obvious than in the world of advancing technology, where things that we once used to love, like VHS tapes, are now considered crap. And I just love this idea of a little creature that goes around eating the VHS tapes and playing their contents on a wall for the benefit of all the dead batteries. They're all running to have a look, see what's happening. So just to focus on one particular character, this little guy, which we called Micro Dog, and I realise it's probably a descendant in some ways of the hairy little trumpet dog, with the face of a microscope lens. This is the concept drawing. This is a painted texture, so everything, as you'll see in the exhibition, it's explained in more detail, but everything in the film is basically covered with hand-painted textures, and the reason we did that was, well, it's kind of an easy thing to do, but mainly so that it looked like a handcrafted world and has some kind of human touch to the otherwise abstract geometry of the virtual shapes. So here you can see the concept drawing of the creature, the initial digital model, which is always looks like a piece of grey plasticine when you first receive it. And then I'd work with Tom and we would adjust it, and I usually drew over the top of his images. I would just print them out and draw over the top because I'm so non-technical. I'd just do everything with a pencil. And then finally supplying the textures and wrapping the creature in those textures to see how they look. And there's an example of the same thing done with the proud parents characters. All the signage in the city was created as if they were real signs, which involved a combination of painting signs, digitally degrading surfaces, and scanning in found surfaces that were kind of rusty or a little bit worn out. The idea of the world in The Lost Thing is that it's kind of like an old world. It's like technology has been arrested at some time in the 1950s and it's just continued on forever, using the same objects and constantly maintaining them without any actual progress. And so everything is a little bit worn and rusty. The great thing about having the illustrated book, and that I'd kept all the artwork in the book, I hadn't sold any, which is something that's tempting to do when you're a starving illustrator, but I had this intuition when I did The Lost Thing, I really need to hang on to all this artwork. So some 10 years later, I was able to scan in the original paintings and pull little elements from the background and reuse them in the actual film, which saved me having to paint them all over again. So this is a street frontage, which you see in the scene where the boy is leading the Lost Thing down the scene we call Collins Street, and all the workers are going in the opposite direction. And this is a painted texture that was used in lots of different places in the Utopia world, where it's kind of the opposite. It's brightly coloured, it's fluid, it doesn't mean anything in particular, it's you know, no rectilinear lines, everything is at an angle or a bit curly. And then the clouds, there were many different paintings of clouds for the background, skyscapes, and for me it was very important that the sky looked painted, that things looked a little bit fake, like you're watching a little diorama that somebody had made in a shoebox, rather than any attempt to create a realistic universe. I also, to some extent, had to go back and illustrate the story all over again, particularly for the purposes of lighting design. And I noticed from an exhibition that was here at Acme that the staff at Pixar generally use pastel crayons to do what are called colour scripts, laying out the entire story of a film as little coloured panels, so you get a sense of the palette of the entire picture. And so I did the same thing. I just got out my pastel crayons, which I was using for sketching anyway, and I sketched a lot of the scenes. And what you get is a very impressionistic feeling to the image. And the focus is almost like reduced down to something to do with atmosphere, which is what lighting is largely about. And so this was really, I didn't realise at the time that this became so useful when it came to doing all the lighting for our digital models, because that's the thing that really brings life into the picture. It actually looked quite terrible before you added lighting. It was like awful to look at, but once the lighting came on, suddenly you were in the universe. And then sound and other things added further dimensions. So it's very much this case of building things up in levels. If we look at an example, this is from the final scene on the tram platform, where there is this little creature looking wistfully into a post box, trying to, again, create some kind of connection with this inanimate object, and everybody else is just sort of walking past, ignoring it. This is the animatic, and this is basically the film plotted out in rough geometry from beginning to end, very jerky and wooden, quite awful to look at, and requiring a great deal of imagination on behalf of the creative team to work out what it's going to look like in the final pass. There's a pastel crayon sketch to try and get an idea of what does the scene feel like. So we know what the content is, but what's the feeling? And then the final, putting all the bits together, you know, like rendering and textures, and we would generally do lots and lots of these still shots because it takes so long for the computer to crunch through the rendering to develop an animated scene. So most of the time we were working on faith that, okay, if we can do one still shot and imagine it moves in a certain way, we'll end up with the film that we desire at the end. And that more or less worked. Sometimes you were surprised, pleasantly and unpleasantly, but generally it worked, and you know, we were able to gradually start doing one scene after another over a period of about 3.5 years, like when we actually got our act together and, you know, had all the pre-production done and we were ready to animate. The whole project spanned 10 years, the production time of the animation, largely because it kept being shelved for various reasons. And if you include the development of the book, that was about 13 years. So it's a long time to be thinking about the same story. But one thing I found fascinating about this one was I just liked it more and more. The more time I spent with the story, the more I liked it. And even now I still like it, so that's kind of a good sign. So to look a little bit at creative process more broadly, and because I'm sure many of you here might be illustrators or looking to be illustrators, I thought I'd explain a little bit about, you know, how I work. It's not for everybody, but it works for me. And it's developed largely through trial and error, since I didn't really study illustration formally outside of high school. Most of my ideas begin as sketches in notebooks, often quite small notebooks that I can carry around with me. I seem to get a lot of ideas when I'm in a vehicle for some reason, or in the shower. Unfortunately, I don't have a waterproof sketchbook, but it's nice to be able to have something that you can jot down ideas very quickly while they're fresh in your mind, because if you plan on doing it later, you will never get around to it and you will forget much like a dream. A good idea is like a deep sea fish. It's all bright and colourful, deep in the subconscious, but if you pull it up too quickly, it'll die and deflate and be this grey coloured jelly by the time you get it to the surface. The act of sketching in a sketchbook is almost like a way of coaxing ideas gently through that decompression from the subconscious up into the conscious world without destroying them, and it's a tricky business. I get around it by drawing very loosely, often using a biro, and usually I don't usually buy the really nice sketchbooks. I like to draw on pretty bad bits of paper or something quite cheap because it feels like I'm not doing art. The moment I start thinking I'm doing art or writing a story, everything starts to seize up and become very mannered and laboured. But if you're not thinking too much and just sort of daydreaming on the page, you can actually come up with some good stuff. It doesn't have to make sense either, which is a very liberating realisation. You can worry about all that later. The main thing is to just get that stream of consciousness down. So some of it is just sitting there and drawing, but often I find that's difficult to do. Like if you give me a blank bit of paper and say draw something interesting, I'm really going to choke and struggle. And that often happens if I have to give a talk to kids and they say draw something and I'm like, please God no, because I won't know what to do. And they're like, is this actually the real guy? Because he claims to be so imaginative and everything. I've discovered that I need a trigger. I can't create something out of nothing. I need a trigger. And so for me, a good place is often museum collections. So if I do go to an exhibition, I always take a little notebook and do drawings of the things that I like. I don't look at everything. And that's a good way of looking at an exhibition. You don't have to look at everything because it's exhausting. You just find a few things that you really like and focus all your attention on them and draw them. So these were some drawings from the Anthropology Museum when my wife and I visited Mexico City. And we both just loved these really ancient little pots that were so humorous with funny little parrots and cats and things. Maybe they had some other significance that we're not aware of, but I tend to look at things in a very naive sort of way and purely for their formal shapes. These are some drawings from the Met in New York. And I became very interested in the oceanic art, actually, in that museum. And I guess what attracts me are things not that I like already, but stuff that is like quite unfamiliar to me and striking. And sometimes I force myself to draw things that I don't like in order to learn something about them. And it's a good way of having some kind of revelation. Don't always do the things that you're attracted to, or you end up doing the same stuff all the time. It becomes a self-feeding cycle. I go out and get something quite random and think, okay, I'm going to draw this now. And then the experience of drawing all those things, you sort of carry them in your mind, and when it comes time to just freely sketching, you can regurgitate them in some sort of weird arrangement. One of the things I like to do is these little stream of consciousness sketches where I just draw a thumbnail square, almost literally the size of a thumbnail, just tiny so it doesn't feel very important. And then I draw a little picture and I write something underneath, move on to the next one very quickly and see if anything happens. Most of the time it's terrible. There's no story, it's just kind of like a dream, doesn't make any sense. But occasionally you will get this interesting little story happening, and with a little bit of nurturing you can develop it. So here are pages where I've started to pick out some of those little loose sketches and think that idea is pretty good. I'll develop them a bit more into a secondary sketch. So you can see there's a story there about a boy with half his head is a cat's head. It's been sewn on. What's that about? Well, I just start writing to try and figure out what the image is about. The other one is about a man who's hasn't died but it's become a skeleton without dying, and the problems that he has in daily life of getting by as a skeleton. You know, I don't really know why I'm thinking of that, but the important thing is that I develop it without asking that question too much. And then going on to another step, I might do more elaborate drawings, and this time I am producing kind of art, but I have the security of the fact that the ideas have been born in a more silly environment, and so they don't feel too self-important, and I've got to the point of where I'm doing fine lines without having to think too much about what they mean and just concentrate on the shapes and forms that I like. So this is my studio at home, which is basically almost all the work in terms of drawing and painting happens on a table, on a light box that my dad built for me when I was a teenager. And my dad's an architect, so I also borrowed a lot of his equipment that I still use. All my sort of ideas and works in progress and inspirational pictures are stuck up on a pin-up board, and I find that's very important if I like something, to stick it on the wall, because otherwise I won't remember it, and seeing it kind of reminds me, and also it helps me to know what a good picture is, especially by other people, because I forget often what a good painting is. So you have examples of other people's paintings that you like, and it reminds you, okay, that's a good painting. That's how it works. But it's very simple. It's in the front room of a rental house, and that's always been how I've worked ever since I turned my bedroom into a studio, and yeah, just a tiny space, not very complicated. That's a close-up of the pin-up board with some clippings from newspapers and magazines and postcards maybe that people have sent me. All my pencils, they just keep adding in jars and I don't remove anything, so it's kind of like this grassland of pencils now. Boxes of paint, which is my primary image making material. Most of my work is oil painting, and just because it's a very flexible kind of paint, and it's quite forgiving. If you make a mistake, you just let it dry and work over the top of it. And under my desk I have boxes and boxes of printed material that I've collected over years that I use for collage. And collage for me is a really great way of, again, bringing external ideas into an otherwise introverted space. And sometimes if I'm doing a painting, it can work by just getting bits of printed material, tearing them up, gluing them on randomly, and already it's kind of broken the surface tension of the paralysing white canvas. And you already start getting ideas from the shapes that are formed, and so it becomes more of an organic process. So it's like boxes of accidents waiting to happen. And on the other side of the room is my computer table where I do any digital work that I have to do, and I generally keep that to a minimum. Usually colour correction of paintings after they've been scanned. I've tried drawing digitally. Just doesn't really work for me. I prefer the grittiness of physical materials that are then scanned in and manipulated if necessary. But my primary work is always physical on paper or canvas, and I've really approached digital stuff rather reluctantly, although I've enjoyed using it, particularly for preliminary work. So a lot of my sketches are developed digitally because it's very easy, as I mentioned earlier, to cut and paste things. That's been great. Before that, I used to constantly go to the photocopier at my newsagent. This is when I was doing the lost thing. And if you look in the exhibition at some of the sketches, and they've got percentages written all down the side, those were all the percentages that I'd calculated using my ruler and a calculator, so that when I took all my stuff to the newsagents, I could do all my photocopying at once and get all the different scale changes, which I could then take back and arrange on the page and see if they worked. And more recently, I've done the dramatic thing of using another room for painting. So I've been working on a project recently which requires larger scale canvases, and but it's the same sort of setup: pin-up board, paints, an easel this time, so working vertically. But other than that, there's not much difference. And this is a little cartoon that I drew about a typical day in my working life. I was asked to write, fairly autobiographically, and I started off doing that, but then I digressed a little bit, and before I knew it, it turned into a cartoon, and this has been published a few times, but I'll show it to you anyway. So a typical day in the life of an artist, that's what it's meant to be. So waking to the sound of a solitary cicada, stumbling across my own consciousness in the kitchen and wondering what time is it. A still night according to the snow dome, back to bed. That's the best part of the day. Some hours later, waiting out the front for the coffee machine, glad that I remembered to pay my rates. And then all the things that you usually do in the morning to avoid actual work. This is especially true if you're a writer or anybody working on a thesis or something like that. I'm actually working on it because I'm saving time that I'll use later by doing these domestic jobs that I have to do right now. So letting the iguanas out the back, yeah, I don't know where that idea came from, but it felt like a real great metaphor somehow. Answer some emails from 3 years ago. And then, this is like, I always know for me it's time to start working because I look out the window and kids are coming home from school. There's school just downstream. So time to start working. And this is something that you don't see when you look at the work of an artist usually, even in an exhibition, which is, you know, purporting to show the whole creative process, is you don't really see the failure so much. But that's a very important part of artistic practice, and it should be discussed a lot more. It's just not that interesting, and it's kind of depressing. But when you do a project, there is usually, if it's a good project, I find there's a point about 2/3 of the way in when it just looks awful, and you hate it more than anything, and you lose all hope, and you feel like abandoning it. And so this drawing here is about that point. And I find if you can work past that point, usually you end up with something pretty good. But it can often make the difference, I think, between a successful artist and an unsuccessful artist. Not so much talent or good ideas or stuff like that, but your ability to get past the crisis point. That for me has been the biggest challenge, I think, in my career is resisting the urge to abandon, you know, because that is a strong urge when you're doing creative work. It just feels so pointless. But first you have to go through this process of having a little period of depression. It's like, oh, it's all terrible. Why am I doing a book that nobody is even asking for? You know, nobody necessarily wants to read. It doesn't make sense. That means I don't make sense, etc., etc. The reason birds also figure so prominently in my work is that we live with birds. They just fly freely around the house. And so they're kind of like these little voices of some kind of conscience. And they love to just sit on top of your head, which is always delightful. It's like an honour that the bird wants to sit on top of your head. Sometimes leave a small donut there, but that's okay. And then, you know, you haven't achieved anything for the day, but that's okay because you can let the iguanas back in. It feels like you're doing something. So that's an example of, you know, my typical day. And so I just wanted to end by talking briefly about some recent projects, unpublished stuff. So this is an image for a book I've been working on for a couple of years, and before that on and off quite a bit. And it's called Rules of Summer. And like most of my projects, had a very long gestation because I didn't really know what it was about. I just kept doing these little drawings of two characters. Sometimes it was a boy and a girl, and sometimes they were adults or children involved in weird situations where there is some tension between them. And for a long time I was trying to wrangle a story out of this. You know, I thought, oh, there has to be a story, like who are they? What's their relationship? Where's the beginning, middle and end? And then I kind of got to the realization that they don't even need to have a story. Like, those images are fine by themselves. Why do I have to explain everything with a narrative? It also reminded me that I really love watching movie previews, often more than the movies themselves. And sometimes I find it very disappointing when I finally see the film, because the preview was awesome. Partly because my mind was making up the story. You know, they show you all these nice little snippets. you know, the Phantom Menace. I'm watching the preview and my mind is just building these elaborate connections between these little glimpses, and it's also tantalising. And then the final film is so disappointing because everything's really literal and badly done. So I thought, instead of risking ruining the narrative, why don't I just do the preview of the story? In other words, do all the chapters as singular images where you don't even see what's going on. Let the reader do the work, you know. I'll just focus on what I can do well, which is a few paintings. So here's a one sketch, preliminary sketch for the book, and the title of the painting is "Never Eat the Last Olive at a Party," because we all know that's like, you can't do that. Oh, you first, you first. And for me, it was the important thing about this picture was the little brother is just impulsively reaching for the olive, and the older brother is grabbing the back of his tuxedo and just yanking him back and saying, "Don't do it." There's sort of a bit of a story behind this which relates to my nervousness of going to the Oscars and saying something stupid. This is the final painting. And they ended up being two boys, which is interesting because I really resisted doing them as familiar characters that I know, but in the end they ended up being my brother and me. It's just something that felt right, and I tried to make them fictional characters, but it just became more and more autobiographical as it went on, and I found myself drawing on childhood memories. So part of my concept for this book was that you start off with little details, particularly character details. So something like this, which is fairly sort of ordinary, but the context is strange. So when you pull out, you see something quite unusual. So that's what they're cowering from, and the title of the picture is "Never Leave a Red Sock on the Clothesline." And so this became a pattern for each image, is don't do this, don't do that. It's like the older brother telling the younger brother constantly these arbitrary rules, which, as you may recall from your childhood, if you had an older sibling, you would often be hammered with these rules, and you weren't allowed to question them. And often they were just stupid. But I wondered, well, what if they were actually fairly legitimate, you know, and that you should really pay attention to them. The book is also being developed simultaneously as an app, which is an interesting process, especially for someone like me who is normally resistant to technology. Like I've never been a big fan of, I wasn't actually such a huge fan of animation before I got involved with it, but I've never been a big fan of digital books, particularly digital picture books. It really bothers me when I start to see a painting that's had a piece cut out and it's sort of moving, because I like the timeless universe of the static painting. But the way we're developing this app, and it's with a Melbourne-based company called Wheelbarrow, is that there is no movement in the image, but there is the ability to zoom in and out. So you start off seeing on the screen this image, and when you pull out, you realise there's much more to the picture, and so you get that nice revelation, which is very difficult to get with a picture book without using up lots of pages or something like that. And it's kind of interesting to do a work that works in both formats, because they become different kind of stories and have a totally different feeling. And this will also have a soundtrack, and I'm working with an experimental sound designer in New York who I met some years ago, to create this sort of weird soundscape that goes with the images. So it'll be interesting to see how that develops. So those projects are both due to be released in October, but they're still in the works at the moment. Another project that I recently completed, which was something quite different for me, was a series of illustrations for retellings of Grimm's fairy tales by Philip Pullman. And this came to me via my German publisher, so I have a good relationship with a German publisher who's normally sub-licensed my works that were published in Australia. And they asked me if I'd be interested in illustrating something directly for them. And I thought, well, no, I don't have time to illustrate 50 Grimm's tales. But then I had the idea, after reading through them, of doing sculptures. I think the idea of illustration is often very tedious for me. Like the thought of doing an illustration, I'd rather be watching TV or something. You know, it's just you have to sit down and do all these tiny little lines and, you know, squint, screw your face up and hunch over. I just didn't want to do that. But then I thought, well, if I do sculpture, I can go and sit in the backyard in the sunshine and I can just squeeze bits of clay. And I bought myself a nice camera and I set up some desk lights and I thought I can photograph these pretty well. But I also thought it was an appropriate response to the text, because I noticed in Philip Pullman's introduction to this book, which is called Grimm Tales, that he said the great thing about Grimm's fairy tales is they don't have any character development, and that everything is like flat cardboard cutouts, and it really doesn't need to be illustrated. And I thought, well, there's a challenge. The author is saying these stories are best left just like as shadow puppetry, like the most minimal illustration. And so I thought, well, the sensible response is to reduce these stories down into physical objects. And so conceptually, I think it was quite an interesting exercise to try and illustrate stories that were just about things that happen in quick succession without much atmospheric development. And so I'd always wanted to do sculpture for a book as well. I feel there's so much opportunity for basically stop motion without the motion. And so this was kind of like the opportunity I've been waiting for. It was also like a nice chance to do something quite simple and involving a lot of physical modelling and carving. And I produced 50 illustrations for this book and photographed them. And I guess this sort of brings me back to the beginning of my talk, where the theme I wanted to talk about was the way in which storytelling and art is an opportunity to communicate with each other across a void, even though we're all very different. Like each of us are very different people, we're all separate universes. But if we can somehow connect through that ignorance of each other and create meaning out of something that doesn't involve necessarily a direct transmission, then that's okay, and something has been achieved. So, you know, this image is more or less an illustration of that. A story called Little Brother and Little Sister, where the brother gets turned into a deer by an evil witch, and he's very deer-like in his behaviour. He's become an animal, but the little sister still loves him and looks after him. So it's a very touching story. But it does get to the heart of what it means to live in this world with so many different things around you that you have to deal with, because those things aren't you. You've got to deal both with yourself and all the stuff that's not you, and that's a tricky business. And I thought I'd just end with this image, which is one of my own favourite paintings because it so well summarises the creative practice, I think, to some extent. Although, of course, when I was painting it, I was just thinking, how cool would it be to have a big water buffalo sitting in a vacant suburban lot giving directions to kids? But on reflection, I think everything in this picture has something to say about the storytelling process and about basic human communication, even though it's a large animal. And that is that, you know, there's this buffalo that can't speak, but it can still give advice by pointing vaguely in a direction. And it's really the responsibility of the person asking the question or approaching the water buffalo, which I see kind of as the reader. It's their responsibility to follow the direction and not be given any specific advice or meaning. They have to find it for themselves. And it's enough as an illustrator that I just point people in a vague direction. I don't have to do that much work. I don't have to explain a whole lot of stuff. I trust that with their own imagination and their own motivation, people will find meaning somehow. It won't be the meaning that I imagine or the meaning I might have even started off trying to communicate, but it'll be some other kind of meaning that's hopefully useful for them and something I might not be able to imagine myself. So on that note, I'll stop lecturing and maybe we can have some questions and bit more of a chat. Thanks.